Bedlam, or Bethlem Royal Hospital to give it its full name, is actually the world's oldest psychiatric institution. It began life in 1247 in the Priory of St Mary of Bethlehem, which stood where we now find Liverpool Street Station in London. Yet the hospital has inspired a range of books, films and TV series, with its infamous reputation lasting well into the 21st century. The hospital has since become a valued institution for psychiatric treatment, yet the ghosts of its former incarnations still linger. After all, the word Bedlam, meaning chaos, came from this very hospital. People shortened Hospital of St Mary of Bethlehem to Bethlehem and then Bedlam in around the 1660s, and the word also went on to inspire the word Bedlamite, used to describe someone suffering from insanity from around the 1620s. So how did this hospital gain such a fearsome reputation, and how has that reputation survived well beyond the hospital's adoption of new practices? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are beginning our new theme this month, and this time we're going to be having a look at buildings with fearsome reputations that have actually outlived the structure themselves. And I've started off with Bedlam because I did ask if anyone wanted an episode on Bedlam way back in the Walbrook episode, and a couple of people went, "Ooh, yes please," so I thought I shall have a look. Now, people might be wondering, what has this got to do with folklore? And obviously folklore is a really, really massive area, and I think it's also well worth bearing in mind that anything that kind of involves a legend of some description could therefore be considered folklore, and the legends associated with Bedlam are based in fact, but the way that we continue to use them in fiction in particular does then, I think, put this in the realm of both history and folklore, but also popular culture, which, let's be honest, is my background, so I thought we'll have a look at it. And I will point out that this episode obviously does include discussion of madness and mental illness. Clearly there are no aspersions being cast on either of these things because obviously madness is just a part of life. But I will say that obviously where I'm talking about madness a lot of the time, it's actually other people's attitude to it that's the problem, not the madness itself. And where I refer to the reputation of the institution, I'm going to use Bedlam, whereas Bethlem refers to the hospital itself, in case you're wondering why there's a bit of a slippage between the two. But I do think that it's worth having a look at a potted history of Bethlem before we get into where Bedlam comes from. And the Priory of St Mary of Bethlehem gained a reputation as a refuge for the infirm and sick by around about the mid-14th century. After all, Bethlehem in Palestine had a long association with caring for the sick, because St Paul built a hostel for pilgrims near the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, where obviously pilgrims could stay and, if necessary, get treatment. But in the medieval era, and I quote, Bethlehem became a byword for thieving, degeneracy and institutionalised corruption, end quote. So to give an example, Peter the porter traded the food and bedding of his patients for cash, leaving his patients to starve and freeze. By 1346, Bethlehem's reputation as a destitute ruin was so bad that the poor and sick avoided it in favour of the nearby convent of St Mary's Spital. Now, those suffering with mental illness didn't actually come to Bethlem until the 1370s, when Richard II closed the stone house in Charing Cross, and this small hospital that specifically worked with the mentally ill was near the mews where he kept his falcons, and there is some suggestion that the noise from the patients disturbed the birds. Now, people first referred to Bethlem as catering for, and I quote, insane patients in 1403, but you do need to remember that this was a time when few places actually provided for the mentally ill in Europe, because in Christian Europe, madness brought shame to families because it implied bad genetics or demonic possession. Family members might be hidden in cellars or even put in cages unless they were turned onto the street to fend for themselves. So in such a climate, the establishment of Bethlem offered somewhere specific for people to go. There was also a sense, unfortunately, that endured well into the 19th century and in some places beyond, that people who suffered with mental illness couldn't feel heat or cold, which was a belief used to justify the poor treatment of them. And even in the 15th century, some believed that isolating those with mental illness in dark, quiet rooms would force them to come to their senses. Following the Reformation, Bethlem was refounded as one of 5 royal hospitals, and King Henry VIII granted the right to run the hospital to the City of London in 1547. Remember, the City of London is a designated area in and of itself. It's its own authority within the wider metropolis, which is just one of many weird quirks that London has. But by the mid-17th century, Bethlem needed a new building because the existing building was already over 400 years old and couldn't accommodate the increased number of patients. So architect Robert Hooke designed a palatial hospital, which is often compared to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, in the Baroque style on Moorfields, where we now find London Wall. While the area is rather built up now, when the new building opened in 1676, it was surrounded by parkland, and the land was really given over to be specifically used for the founding of an asylum. And the building actually held the honour of being the country's first purpose-built mental hospital. 2 stone statues, and what they depict, the names sometimes vary, but in one of the sources I looked at said that they depicted raving madness and melancholy madness. Other sources say that they represent acute mania and dementia, so it varies. But they're these 2 stone statues that topped the entrance gate, so you knew precisely where you were going and why when you passed them. It is also quite interesting that where we talk about these ideas of madness, the term patient only came into common usage in the 18th century, with patients referred to as lunatics before this. And you do sometimes see patients at Bethlehem being referred to as inmates as well. I've tried to refer to them as patients instead to try and give these poor people a little bit of dignity back. But the speed of construction of the Moorfields building may have impressed the backers, but it came at a cost. This is also quite wet, boggy land as well, and there was all kinds of issues with subsidence and what have you quite early on. And as early as 1699, satirist Thomas Browne noted the poor state of repair, asking who was more mad, the people who ordered the building or those who lived in it. By 1815, the building was already crumbling, and patient numbers were still increasing, so a site for a new hospital was found at St George's Fields in Southwark. The design for that building opted for smaller wards, meaning that patients could be classified into a wider range of groups. So instead of patients all just more or less being thrown in together, you could then have people with similar diagnoses in a room with people with the same diagnoses as them. Now, changing attitudes also meant that people began to look unfavourably on outdated and barbaric ideas around physical restraints, and a House of Commons committee learned of the plight of James Norris, a patient who had been physically restrained with iron bars chained to the wall. Physician Thomas Munro tried to reassure the committee that they would only use such restraints on paupers, since gentlemen would not appreciate it. I'm not really going to say much else about that because Dr. Munro resigned in 1816 following the investigation by the committee. But then we also have a period in which the Lunacy Act of 1845, again could have been better named, meant counties needed to provide asylums, which led to a boom in the construction of psychiatric hospitals around Britain. Now that county asylums could cater for pauper patients, Bethlem stopped admitting them in 1857 and they focused instead on patients on low incomes. Bethlehem moved to its current location, a former country estate in Beckenham, in 1930, and the central block of the old St George's Fields building is now the Imperial War Museum. But let's take a look at what contributed to Bedlam's terrible reputation that still lingers in the popular imagination. Well, the first idea is the fact that quite horrifically the hospital was open to visitors in earlier centuries. Now, this was not visitors who were coming in to bring some kind of comfort to their loved ones, rather Bedlam was considered one of the shows or tourist attractions of London. Visitors crowded the Moorfields building on public holidays, desperate to view the patients. The official line was that seeing the patients in such states of distress was supposed to offer moral lessons about the price of sin, and this naturally relied on the assertion that mental illness was the end result of poor choices and bad behaviour, rather than seeing mental illness as something that could and did happen to anyone. More enterprising visitors sold cheesecake, fruit and nuts in the galleries, while the keepers acted like carnival barkers, drawing attention to their charges as if they were prize exhibits. Naturally, offering a show of sorts provided a source of income for the hospital. Yet thieves stole food and clothing from the patients, while sex workers wandered the corridors looking for clients. Patients might rattle their chains to get attention, or sing popular ballads in the hope visitors might give them gin. Yet commentators have actually wondered who came out of this worse. Bedlam was considered both an institution and an image, so it existed both as a physical building and as an idea. So for some, Bethlehem simply reflected the state of the city. And Jonathan Swift commented that the country could try recruiting its politicians and generals from Bethlehem, since they couldn't be any more insane than those the country already had. Journalist Ned Ward claimed to have heard a patient criticise the government, and when he told the patient he should be hanged for treason, the patient apparently replied to point out that he had the privilege of speaking his mind given where he was. So exactly who was worse, the patients or the people charging admission to see them, or indeed the people paying admission to see them? But by the 17th century, Bethlehem now also housed a particularly interesting group of patients, which were political prisoners. And some of these did demonstrate some degree of mental illness or paranoia or something along those lines. So, for example, Richard Farnham, the Colchester weaver, claimed to be Jesus before trying to overthrow Charles I. But because he had so much popular support, it was actually safer for the regime to put him in Bethlem Hospital than it was to execute him for treason. Likewise, Bartholomew Helston ended up in Bethlehem in 1607 after claiming to be the son of Mary Queen of Scots. And this continued, with Margaret Nicholson, the unemployed seamstress who attacked George III with a dessert knife, also put into Bethlehem. That said, this came after the intervention of the king, who also recognised the act as a cry for help, so putting her into Bethlehem allowed her to avoid the death sentence, because I think he realised she wasn't actually trying to kill him, she was basically trying to get some attention, and he obviously thought he was helping by having her put in Bethlehem instead of executed. But other prisoners did end up in Bedlam to suit their families, and a man simply known as Mr. Evans managed to prove that not only was he entirely sane, but he'd been the victim of a conspiracy to have him committed to Bethlem Hospital, and he won £30 in compensation. Catherine Linnet, a servant, fell ill and a doctor prescribed morphine, but after becoming delirious, her husband called for 2 local doctors. They actually initially refused to certify her as insane, but then Mr. Linnet's persistence wore them down, and she spent 7 months at Bethlehem until she was released because she hadn't actually shown any signs of insanity. And this is something that we do then start to see within the popular imagination, the idea that inconvenient people could then find themselves in asylums and so on to keep them out of the way. And indeed, it even becomes a plot point in Sweeney Todd, A String of Pearls. So it does become this idea that you could just get rid of particularly a wealthy woman to get access to her money by having her committed to Bedlam. But of course, something that often affects how people actually perceive a person, place or thing is how it appears in popular culture. So think of it this way. If I asked you to picture a clever, trustworthy babysitter, did you see her wearing glasses? Probably, because we have this notion that somebody wearing glasses is either clever or trustworthy, when ultimately they're wearing glasses just simply because they can't see properly. And we associate things with concepts through their continual use to represent an idea. I'm not going any further into semiotics, don't worry, but it is something to bear in mind, because Bedlam is no different, because of the fact that we associate it with various concepts and ideas, because of the way that it's used to represent those ideas. And its fearsome reputation does echo through history, but how we think of it is largely influenced by popular culture instead. This also isn't a new phenomenon, because until the middle of the 16th century, people outside of London knew about Bedlam through the Bedlam ballads, and there are 20 or 30 plays featuring Bedlam as a location, or indeed Bedlamites as characters. Bedlam patients were often cast in the clown role in these productions, although questions around the nature of madness as the decades progressed saw these associations of patients and clowns evolve. The focus on Bedlam as an image helped to cement the popular link between Bethlehem and ideas of barbaric treatment, chaos and madness. And popular culture keeps these ideas alive. So if we look at the final series of Penny Dreadful, for example, this cast Dr. Jekyll as a Bethlem Hospital physician, despite this not being present in the original novel. The production designers chose to mimic the design of the Robert Hooke building, not the St George's Field building, which would have been the home of Bethlehem in the period in which the series was set. By comparison, the Robert Hooke building is easily the more commonly found exterior in images of Bethlem Hospital, and therefore we're more likely to see it and go, oh, Bedlam. So historical accuracy just simply goes out of the window in favour of aesthetics, but also our associations with different types of building. So in doing so, the depiction of the interior echoed with the countless narratives set inside asylums, whether Bethlehem or not. And that is something that I mentioned before about Poltergeist in particular, the idea that films regurgitate images of things. So like I've said with haunted houses, each house becomes haunted by the ones that came before in cinema, and asylums are no different. Now, this does lead to useful questions about the validity of such barbaric punishment in earlier centuries. It does also turn the asylums into a stereotype of themselves, which risks undermining any cultural value they might have had in questioning the treatment of the mentally ill by turning them into spectacles, which was entirely the problem in the first place by charging visitors to see them. But I do want to have a look at a few examples, but obviously this list can't be exhaustive because that would essentially be a whole new PhD thesis for me. So instead we're just going to look at a few of them. And we're going to start off with writers and playwrights, because even Shakespeare brought Bedlam a degree of notoriety, because the word actually meant pandemonium even by the mid-16th century, so this is when it's still in its Bishopsgate location. And Edgar in King Lear disguises himself as a Bedlam beggar to escape a manhunt, because those released from asylums, whether Bedlam or not, often took to wandering the streets looking for shelter. Dramatists visited the hospital looking for inspiration, and the bears on the South Bank were named Bess and Rose of Bedlam. Roy Porter notes that people assumed madness had a particular look, which was also spread by writers and artists. So those suffering with mental illness were usually depicted as somewhat dishevelled, they might be wearing torn or threadbare clothes, and they often had straw in their hair. Former Bethlem patients would actually wear such attire on purpose while begging, further cementing the stereotype. Any songs that they sang appeared as Bedlam ballads, and beggars might actually pretend to be mad so they would be sent to an asylum rather than a prison or a workhouse, and they became known as Tom o' Bedlams. And Tom o' Bedlam itself is actually the name of an anonymous poem discovered in a commonplace book of around about 1620. Many musicians have set it to music, turning it into a ballad, but the poem is written from the point of view of a former patient at Bethlem Hospital who now makes his living through begging. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, and I do think you should look it up, but I did think that two of the stanzas in particular are quite noteworthy. So the first one reads, "From the hag and hungry goblin that into rags would rend you, the spirit that stands by the naked man in the book of moons defend you, that of your 5 sound senses you never be forsaken, nor wander from yourselves with Tom abroad to be your bacon." So he's basically talking here about the idea that you are essentially going with him to earn a living because that's what he has to do. Now, while some beggars did take to masquerading as former Bedlamites, it does seem that our Tom was truly a patient there, as he explains in the second stanza. "Of 30 bare years have I twice 20 been enraged, and of 40 been 3 times 15 endurance soundly caged. On the lordly lofts of Bedlam, with stubble soft and dainty, brave bracelets strong, sweet whips ding dong, with wholesome hunger plenty." That is not the easiest thing to recite, I will say, but Tom boasted in later stanzas of knowing more than Apollo, the Greek god of prophecy, and also being the commander of an host of furious fancies. While Tom's name references those who sought an asylum shelter by pretending to be mad, the poem does attempt to get into the mindset of someone who really understood Bethlem Hospital. As I say, the fact that it's been set to music and recorded by a host of musicians does keep Tom o' Bedlam in the public consciousness, even if we're not entirely aware that he's there. And it wasn't just writers who took their inspiration from Bedlam, because artist William Hogarth also immortalised the hospital in 1733 in The Rake's Progress. This was a series of 8 paintings that depicted the fall of Tom Rakewell, a fictional rich heir who moved to London, frittered away his money and was jailed in first the Fleet Prison and then Bethlem. Yet Hogarth was critical of society rather than those who needed Bethlem services, so The Rake's Progress didn't mock the patients but rather the viewer or the people who paid to visit him. We do have the final image in which it looks like he's being restrained and all hope has gone, but the collection of figures around him don't represent types of madness but rather elements of British society, from tailors to astronomers. Hogarth's illustration also played on the idea that sin caused madness, which explained why the debauched rake ended up in Bethlehem. But it is clear that Hogarth is criticising that idea through the depiction of Bedlam in the image, which is unsurprising given the fact he was a satirist. He did update the final panel in 1763 and put a British coin on the wall, and in doing so Hogarth also implied that Bethlehem actually represented Britain as a whole rather than the piece critiquing madness. And the final element of popular culture that I'd like to have a look at is Bedlam, made in 1946. And essentially in the 1940s, RKO made a string of stylish black and white films that are more gothic than horror. Other ones are films like Cat People or I Walked with a Zombie. But Bedlam, set in 1761, starred Boris Karloff as the hospital warden, Master Sims. He charges twopence for admittance to see the patients, and they're kept in a large room, sleeping in their own filth. A dark corridor beyond the hall is lined with cells, and those prisoners who have been chained up in these cells reach their arms through to those who pass. Nell Bowen, played by Anna Lee, tries to reform the hospital, having seen the patients put on a show in which one of them actually dies, but Sims has her committed in the hospital instead. Nell wins over her fellow patients by looking after them and befriends the 3 most sane men, and I'm using that in inverted commas, because one of them sounds more like a political prisoner, while another is only there to keep him away from alcohol so he can continue his writing career and support his family. And this obviously plays on the idea that there would be people in the hospital who didn't actually belong there, and of course Nell's one of them. When a politician puts pressure on the hospital to release Nell, Sims says he's going to use one of his drastic cures on her, but Nell's new friends intervene. They no doubt know exactly what this cure is going to involve, and thanks to her kindness towards them, decide that this isn't something that's going to happen if they can prevent it in any way. Now, the film is actually available on the Internet Archive if you do want to see how it ends, so I don't want to give away any spoilers about that. And it is definitely worth a watch. Now, one of the reasons I chose Bedlam for this episode and not one of the other films bearing the same name was the attention to detail paid by the production team, because director Mark Robson openly acknowledged how much the Rake's progress influenced the film, and also described how they, and I quote, virtually used Hogarth as their art director, end quote. Panels from the series appear throughout the film, underscoring the links between Hogarth's work and the depiction of Bedlam in the film. The film also highlights the exploitation of the inmates for financial gain, the dreadful conditions in which they were kept, and the focus on punishment over treatment or care, which isn't really bad for a film made in 1946, even if its language used around madness and mental illness can leave a lot to be desired in places. But ultimately, what do we actually make of all of these different things that have contributed to how we think about Bethlehem, or indeed Bedlam, as an idea? Well, given the fact that Bethlehem was a single hospital in a single city, the extent of its reputation might seem unusual. Yet its appearance in satire and fiction spreads its influence beyond its physical reach, which helps explain why it remains familiar today. Clearly, the treatment practices of Bethlehem changed with the times, and nowadays Bethlehem is a psychiatric hospital run by the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, and its history absolutely does not reflect the institution as it stands today. And perhaps this is why it is helpful to draw a line between Bethlehem the hospital and Bedlam the idea. Bethlehem was capable of change, while Bedlam remains fixed in our imaginations as a terrifying place of mistreatment and degradation. It has become visual shorthand in popular culture to stand in for the brutality and inhumanity of earlier centuries, exploiting popular and flawed ideas of madness for entertainment purposes, much as creatives in earlier times used the patients to provide entertainment as well. Now, while Bedlam has perhaps been superseded by cinematic asylums such as the Oregon State Hospital in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or the mighty Danvers in Session 9, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen it, it is still the word that we reach for when we want to describe unmitigated chaos. So I want to know what you think. Do you think that Bedlam is an idea that you're particularly familiar with? Obviously, this will be really interesting to hear from people who are from outside of the United Kingdom to see how it sort of spread into other territories. Were you particularly familiar with the fact that Bedlam, the word, was actually based on something? Please do feel free to let me know. In the next episode, we're going to have a look at another London site which no longer exists, which is the infamous Newgate Prison, and the Old Bailey now stands on its site, so it did used to have quite a prominent location as well. I haven't decided what the third episode's going to be about yet. That one's still got a couple of possibilities attached to it. But the final episode, we are going to have a look at the Amityville house, because I know people have really enjoyed these episodes where I've then looked at things from cinema and looked at how that then has links with folklore and legend as well. And that one is actually going to be recorded live at the QED conference in Manchester at the end of the month. So that particular episode will go out a little bit later than usual, but it will still be within the same weekend. And it will also be live, so it'll be interesting to see how that works, because I've never done a live episode before. That could all go horribly wrong, but we shall see. So I do hope that you've enjoyed this particular episode. I do hope that you enjoy this particular theme as well, because I think places do have such a major hold over people's imaginations. And while I think in folklore it often ends up relying on things like standing circles in places like Stonehenge and so on, these other buildings which are much more within our reach are just as interesting to have a look at as well. And obviously I do have a bit of a bee in my bonnet about the fact that folklore can often reach to rural environments and this sort of romanticised idyllic past, whereas cities and urban environments are often far closer to what we actually have experience of, and there's plenty of folklore to be found there as well. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll see you next week when we head off to Newgate Prison. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.